Michael, how are you? I'm Robert Thorson. I'm a member of the Thoreau Society, have been since 2009, a very active member, a life member. It's my pleasure to be able to moderate this session of 3 talks. It's a session on Thoreau and health, just like all of the rest of them. We have 3 speakers, and I'm going to give you a super brief biography of them. And then after I give you that super brief biography, I'm going to just introduce the idea of the talk and the protocol and the plan, and then we'll just take it off 3 talks in a row. Dale, let me go to the people first. Here we go. And I'm going to read it so I don't mess it up. Dale Potts is Associate Professor of History at South Dakota State University. He's been teaching courses in the U.S. and world history, environmental history, American Indian and Indigenous studies, and also does popular nature writing as well. Okay, so he will be our first speaker without slides. The second one is Sonia Paradis. She's a PhD candidate at the Center for the Study of Contemporary Religion in Sherbrooke University in Quebec, Canada. I almost said Quebec, Ontario. That would be a big mistake. Okay, and and let's see. My third one here is there is G. Jason Giannetti. There, I got it right. He's the author of Chrysalis: The Adventures in Layman Piang, Modern Art in Context, and Naked Zen. Okay, he's been part of the Alcott Summer Conversational Series for over a decade and taught philosophy at various colleges and universities. He also facilitates the Ishoji East Zen Center. Okay, so that's our lineup. And the basic theme is that each is supposed to talk 12 to 15 minutes, but we have 15 because we have 3 instead of 4 speakers here. So we'll go through those at 15 minutes apiece in the order that I introduced you. And then after that, we will have questions from the audience. And I think that that's the plan. All set? Okay, let's get going. Then our first talk is going to be by Dale Potts. And you have the title right there. You ready to come up? Good.
Thorson. Okay.
And I'm going to set a timer.
Okay. I'll set one too.
And it will go off at 13 minutes. That gives you 2 minutes more to finish.
Okay. American nature writing in the 20th century included the work of trained Western scientists, such as wildlife biologist Olaus Murie, who traveled to Alaska in the early part of the century with his wife Mardie to study bird life, caribou herds, and other flora and fauna. Their efforts helped to foster public interest in legislation for the preservation of the Alaska National Wildlife Refuge and the subsequent 1964 Wilderness Act. In their popular publications, Olaus and Mardie Murie acknowledged indigenous spaces in the Arctic and subarctic circles that included concern for the health and welfare of indigenous populations. The Muries represented the emergence of biology as a field discipline at universities. Wildlife biology is a major field of study, though they came with a long legacy of Enlightenment naturalist thought that drew on the interconnections of natural phenomena. And by the early 20th century, the importance of Thoreau as scientist, philosopher, and naturalist had begun its ascent. As I embark on a new research project examining nature writers in the 20th century and their interactions with indigenous tribes and individuals, I believe that going back in time, looking at similarities between previous generations and that of the 20th century may bear fruit. So one similarity that the Muries had in common with Henry David Thoreau when it came to indigenous people, I believe, was cultural empathy to a degree. I am not a Thoreau scholar. My background is environmental history, and researching how naturalists viewed indigenous peoples over time has always interested me, in that the popular publications they created inspired populations in the 20th century to support environmental legislation. You can go back to Henry David Thoreau to explore his associations with indigenous culture in Maine and Minnesota with scholars such as Richard Fleck, outlining how Thoreau's understanding of native culture deeply influenced his lifestyle, his thoughts, and his being, as a keen observer of the nature around him, but also of people he encountered. As Laura Dessau-Walls writes, after Thoreau's trip to the Maine woods, he never missed a chance to praise Indians and defend them against the prejudices of his friends, and to defend their knowledge and practices. Here is a commonality I think exists also with writers of a later time. Immersion in a place and its peoples provides a means for the observant to see the interconnectedness of things. In the essay Thoreau and the Revolutionary Indigenous Landscape, in the monograph Unsettling Thoreau, John Cusick describes how Thoreau strove in the last years of his life to develop his ideas about living within place locally. Before I go too far on the thread of the 19th century, I'd like to bring the discussion 100 years after Thoreau and focus it on these individuals. Olaus Murie was also a keen observer of nature and people, someone who believed in the value of indigenous cultural contributions, and someone who could exhibit great empathy toward indigenous ways of life. When he became ill in the early 1960s, Olaus Murie thought back to earlier experiences that he had in the 1910s and 1920s in both Labrador and Alaska. I'm interested now in 1962 by the necessity of examining critically some bills currently in Congress aimed at laying waste some of the beauty of our outdoors with huge appropriations for the purpose. And I wonder, can we compare hectic, unethical motivation in our vast effort to change the face of the earth with the simple, honest motivation shown by those Indians facing coexistence with fellow creatures in their environment? Which is the more worthy? From the standpoint of human spiritual progress, those of us who blindly use machinery and kill polar bears in the Arctic from airplanes, or those who many years ago felt humbly apologetic in shooting down a bear? His viewpoint is a very, very limited understanding of an indigenous concept of reciprocity. It has a lot of problems, but he's voicing something that is at least trying to be empathetic. Thoreau's abhorrence of a preoccupation with industry over connections to land, of wanton waste instead of appreciation, are pretty much echoed here. Having said that, the publications that resulted from Olaus and Mardie, and they did publish different popular books, research efforts and life experiences did not often indicate collaborative engagement with indigenous populations. I wonder if Olaus, Mardie, or Thoreau would view the concept of collaborative research in the same way that we try to today. To that end, at the end of my talk, I'll mention a particular recent source or sources that encapsulate what many indigenous communities are working toward, namely drawing on the strength and persistence of indigenous cultures in the landscape. So writers Olaus and Mardie Murie, among others, acknowledged indigenous spaces, but did not always illustrate how local beliefs and practices demonstrated indigenous maintenance of those spaces, or how, if the population had been dislocated, how they may have been driven then to move away from a sustainable view of traditional land and unwittingly became part of national and international economics. In the 1910s, Olaus Murie was working in Alaska as the fur game warden for the state, displaying his wildlife knowledge as a wildlife biologist. By 1924, the two had married and moved to Bettles, Alaska. Both Mardie and Olaus discuss Indian and Alaska Native cultures, but their perspectives are not those of ethnologists, folklorists, nor of individuals with any expertise in indigenous cultural lifeways. In her work, Two Against the North, 1962, Mardie Murie reminisced about a potlatch ceremony on the Yukon River in honor of President Coolidge declaring Indians to be U.S. citizens in 1924. Okay. Here we could see the event unfold from the perspective of Mardie. The two Kobuk Eskimo with the oil cans finally began, a fairly fast beat of sticks on the cans, the rhythm broken into short phrases as in a song. Their Kobuk companions sat as quiet as cats, so did all the Indians. We could gather that the story was about a hunt of some kind, and at the end, about someone who ate so much they became all swelled up with a great stomach. And at this gesture, the audience burst into laughter. He's sort of doing this, I'm full. Okay, and the performer ended with a broad grin, his face shining like polished walnut. The Eskimo drumming rhythm is compelling. As it goes along and increases in power, you could readily see the psychology of it. You sit stolidly listening until your savage love of rhythm, your pent-up life can stand no more, then out you jump and go at it. unpacking such statements through close readings, finds a warning about overconsumption, but also a sentiment from Mardie faced with an encounter with what she perceives as a population that is other. From Olaus Murray's posthumously published Journeys in the Far North, 1973, while in Upper Canada amongst the First Nations Cree, he records hearing secondhand and filtered through the head of the Hudson's Bay Company and Mr. Moore a folk narrative about why rabbit has little fat. Mr. Moore said, "Some great spirit," now Mr. Moore is white, "some great spirit, I don't know what he was called, portioned out to the animals the fat that they were to have on their bodies. One by one they were dipped in a lake of grease. The rabbit got anxious and jumped into the lake before his turn came. The Great Spirit was displeased with this selfish action. So to punish the rabbit, he took him up and pulled him through his hand, wiping off the grease. For this disobedience, the rabbit was to go without his share. But between his shoulders, in the little cavity back of the neck, a small portion was left after he was wiped off." After hearing his narrative, Olaus stated, "Truly the Indian is a close observer. And like all of us, he has tried his best to interpret observed facts. What shall we think of our attitudes and feelings about the world around us?" These are narratives that look at indigenous peoples as other. That is true. But there is empathy. The anecdotes are meant to demean or embarrass. In this regard, the empathy seems heartfelt. It is possible to mirror such folk narratives with Thoreau's almost seemingly giddy reaction to Joe Polis, telling him about the phenomenon of bioluminescence, autosokwa, from decaying wood in the Allagash and East Branch section of the Maine woods. Thoreau writes, "I let science slide and rejoiced in that light as if it had been a fellow creature. And subsequently, I was prepared after this to hear the most startling and unimagined phenomenon witnessed by his folks. They are abroad at all hours and seasons in scenes so unfrequented by white men. Nature must have made 1,000 revelations to them, which are still secrets to us." Okay. And the last example I'll give here, in Journeys of the Far North, also includes discussions of interactions with not just individuals, but also villages. And so in the village of Allakaket, northwest of Fairbanks, Alaska, Olaus recorded his impressions of the Putu family. Putu is the father, Annie is the wife, and the children had a picture, but okay. So he records his impressions. Olaus told Putu the father European fairy tales and Aesop's fables from Western culture, to the delight of him and his wife and the children. This coaxed Putu to tell Olaus some examples of stories from the people of Allakaket. Putu even revises Olaus's transcriptions. "I told Putu I wanted to write them down so I would not forget. He was interested and asked me to repeat the stories and corrected me on some points. He was now enthusiastic and elaborated on some parts. It can be said that Olaus was concerned about the fate of populations in the 1910s and 1920s, especially in the face of changes wrought by their forcible inclusion into the world economic system via the world fur trade. As Jonathan Waterman writes in Where Mountains Are Nameless, Olaus had already seen how the Hudson Bay Company had stopped the hungry people from hunting on Sunday, which the Iskamu renamed Atingashorak, a time that resembles taboo observance. Waterman also notes that Murie gave them food when his own canned foods and flour ran out. He helped them snare rabbits, muskrats, and ground squirrels, and in exchange, he gained new knowledge about the ways of the Arctic. And in part because of this, they refer to him as Kopanwa Angaraka, for the way little bird white man constantly sought out flying creatures. There is also the fact that Olaus and Mardie Murie are instrumental in pushing for, along with a long list of people associated with the Wilderness Society, for pushing for the creation of the Alaska National Wildlife Refuge. Olaus does not live to see that happen. He doesn't live to see the Wilderness Act passed. But neither does Bob Marshall, Aldo Leopold, though many of these individuals had died prior to this, Mardie Murie was present at the actual signing of the Wilderness Act by President Lyndon Johnson in 1964. In 1980, she comes back and testifies in front of Congress to make sure that people understand the value of the Alaska Wildlife Refuge, to save it from subsequent attempts to try to drill near it as well as within it at that point. So there's a long-standing history that they have with the region. So in conclusion, today there's a further acceptance in mainstream culture of the importance of indigenous viewpoints, traditional ecological knowledge, or more specifically, indigenous ecological knowledge. Perhaps more importantly, indigenous populations have fought nonstop through the century to have their voices heard. Indigenous scholars have long been investigating the roles of traditional learning coming from origin stories, elders, extended family and community, holistic concepts, the environment, spirituality, revitalization, language, and philosophy. As education scholar Dustin William Louis continues, the key to realizing that goal is self-determination for indigenous peoples that extends to telling their own stories. And then just to summarize, in 2023, there is a collaborative effort on the part of tribes throughout Canada, the United States, and I believe Mexico as well, to work and to create what becomes known as wildlife stewardship on tribal lands. It is a massive collaborative research effort involving indigenous researchers, scientists, artists, and elders, and their non-indigenous allies, contemporary tribal efforts across North America to protect and preserve indigenous lands through traditional ecological knowledge. One example, for instance, would be the Indigenous Sentinels Network, a community-based monitoring to enhance food security site and efforts for people who rely specifically on marine resources for sustenance. So there's more acknowledgement today about the importance of this sort of collaborative work. And I've kind of wonder also, and this is just sort of the beginning of my research, on both Olaus and Mardie Murie, how much did they think about the idea of collaboration? Also, how much did they understand the concept of reciprocity when it comes to indigenous people engaging in living on the land, and how reciprocity for indigenous people as a concept ties them to that land? And I think Olaus and Mardie Murie were just starting to see that, but we'll see. Thank you. Thank you.
And now we have Sonia. And the same deal, 13 minutes on the timer.
Yes. So good afternoon, everyone. I'm very happy to be here today and to take part in this annual gathering. My interest in American transcendentalism began with the question of moral perfectionism, which I first encountered through the work of Pierre Hadot and Stanley Cavell. Those writings led me to discover Emerson and Thoreau. What moved me was the idea that self-transformation is never fully completed. In my doctoral research, I place Emerson and Thoreau within a broader reflection on the formation of the modern religious subject in North America. But today, I will focus on Thoreau's representation of the North as a site of learning. We will explore how Thoreau represents Canada, French Canadian, and the landscape that surround them. My aim is to show that these figures, together with that environment, help shape a distinctive Northern imaginary. I would like to begin by clarifying what I mean by the North in Thoreau's writing. In my reading, the North is not only a geographical direction, nor a clearly bounded territory. It appears as a North American space connecting New England, Canada, and indigenous territories, while also taking on symbolic and moral meaning. It refers to place, qualities, and experiences. forest river region less transformed by industrialization and the people who move through this space. Through his writing, journal, correspondence, and notebook, we can see the gradual construction of a northern imaginary. This north is associated with vitality, resistance, learning, and a deeper form of health, physical, mental, and spiritual. It challenges, tests, sometimes disorients, but it also teaches. In this sense, the North echoes moral perfectionism, a way of entering into relation with the world, with nature, with others, and with oneself. We find this present in texts such as Walden, The Main Wood, or Walking, and in the material gathered in the Canada and Indian notebooks. For example, reference to cold, season, forest, and wilder region of the continent often appears as sign of vitality. This wildness is one expression of Thoreau's North. But this representation also takes a human form. The French-Canadian woodchopper embodies a direct relation to work, to the body, to the forest, and to endurance. He becomes one of the figures of this northern imaginary because he carries qualities Thoreau associates with the North. In Thoreau's writing, and especially in the portrait of the French-Canadian woodchopper in Walden, he appears as a man close to the forest, strong, cheerful, simple, enduring, and at ease outdoors. Thoreau admires in him a form of bodily vitality and contentment. In Walden, the Canadian Alec carries white oak bark for a sick man. He chews the inner bark while speaking with Thoreau and prepares a drink made with hemlock leaves. These details suggest practical forest knowledge, but Thoreau also writes that the spiritual man in him sleeps as in an infant. This reveals the limit and the bias of Thoreau's gaze. The figure corresponds to what he associated with the North, but it's also shaped by power relation. And I have to say that this image also belongs to a broader 19th century representation of voyageurs, coureurs des bois, and French-Canadian forest workers. These men were associated with rivers, mobility, physical labor, and territorial knowledge, transmitted or transformed through contact with indigenous peoples. As Jason Newton say in his article, they often appears as figure between two worlds. They are not indigenous, but they are associated with the same territories. We must therefore read this figure carefully. It is based on real encounters and practical knowledge, but also on the representation of its time. So when I speak of an imaginary of the North, I do not mean that it's invented. It's built from real practice, concrete gesture, and a form of territorial knowledge. I think music is a good example. Voyageur, paddler, and forest worker were often associated with singing during travel or work. These songs help maintain rhythm, coordinate movement, and sustain effort. In The Main Wood, Thoreau takes up this musical dimension when he tells us that he and his companions sang Morse Canadian boat song while rowing at night. Strictly speaking, this was not a traditional French-Canadian song. It was an English language literary song inspired by the songs associated with Canadian voyageurs. Still, the passage is revealing. And among the archival material that I consulted yesterday at the Walden Wood Project Library was a manuscript transcription of Voyageur's song composed by John Thoreau. It offers a good example of the connection between songs, French-Canadian culture, and landscape. This northern imaginary does not respect fixed borders. It's circulated with river, forest, voice, and moving bodies. It's a mobile and relational space. Thoreau's trip to Canada East in 1850 was not just one journey amongst others. It was his only stay outside the United States. For a little more than a week, he visited Montreal, Quebec City, and the surrounding area with his friend William Ellery Channing. Like we said, Thoreau did not discover Canada only when he traveled there. He arrived with an imaginary nourished by books, but also by the Canadian he had met around Concord. Yet, what he found disappointed him. Thoreau opens A Yankee in Canada with, and I quote, "I fear that I have not got much to say about Canada, not having seen much. What I got by going to Canada was a cold." But what is interesting is that despite this remark, the trip seems to have led to a great deal of research afterward. His Canada notebook show this effort through reading, note-taking, and historical inquiry. But in A Yankee in Canada, he described a population he perceived as agricultural, Catholic, attached to social order, and less inclined toward revolution and annexation that he may have imagined. They did not correspond to the freer and more mobile forest figure he had encountered around Concord. He does not find the same figure between two worlds. The connection to ancestral knowledge and to territory is not longer visible to him in the same way. This gap is important. Thoreau observed villages, practiced landscape and nature with precision. His description of the St. Lawrence River is especially beautiful and strong. But he also interprets French Canadian through his own Republican and transcendentalist expectation. It is difficult to grasp his thought fully because we have lost an essential part of his note, the 84 missing pages of his journal from that stay. This disappointment does not really alter Thoreau's imagination of the North. Although I have focused mainly on French Canadian, Thoreau's imagination of the North is also deeply connected to his long-standing interest in indigenous people. French Canadian just belong to a broader northern constellation in Thoreau's imagination. Figure who move through forest, river, and borderland, and whose knowledge of the territory overlaps with indigenous presence and older relation to land. Thoreau's interest in indigenous people began early and continued until the end of his life. He gathered notes on language, stories, myth, practice, knowledge, and way of inhabiting the North. His reference to indigenous spirituality and to more holistic approach to medicine are especially revealing, particularly through the passage he selects in the Indian notebook. Thoreau is not only saying that indigenous people live in these territories, he's saying that their stories, belief, and spiritual relations matter. Of course, as you know, Thoreau's view is not simply positive. But over the course of his writing, readings, and experiences, especially through his encounter with indigenous guides, his view become more complex. In other words, the North is also a place of memory, mythology, and spirituality. This reflection brings me to another point, the question of disappearance, or rather erasure, which appear at several moments in Thoreau's writing. In A Yankee in Canada, he writes that the French Canadian give him the impression of sharing the fate of the Indians, or of gradually disappearing into what he called the Saxon currents. Of course, we must read this carefully. French Canadian and indigenous people did not share the same historical fate. I do not want to conflate these two experiences, but in Thoreau's mind, it seems to sense that an older world is being profoundly transformed and in some case erased. It's a sense of oppression. The land is being reshaped by industrialization, colonization, agriculture, road, border, and the expansion of American modernity. Through his narrative, and especially his notebook, once again, Thoreau tried to gather and preserve trace of this transforming world, even if his gaze remains marked by the limit of his time. He bears witness to form of loss affecting people, language, land, and even relationship between body, nature, health, and the spiritual. In this sense, the North becomes a place where the tensions between colonialism, modernity, memory, and transformation become visible. I would like to return to the idea that has guided his presentation. In Thoreau's writing, the North becomes a space imagined and experienced through the land and several figures. Here we can find a key dimension of moral perfectionism, the idea that self can be displaced, tested, formed, and transformed through its relation to the land. We often speak of wildness in Thoreau's work, that source of vitality, preservation, resistance to excessive domestication. But I would like to suggest is that this wildness belongs to a larger vision of the Northern imaginary. That's why I would like to propose another concept that I have developed. It's called North American Borealism. This concept is also useful for thinking about Emerson's vision of the North and other writers of the same period. I take inspiration here from Edward Said's concept of Orientalism, not to establish a direct equivalence, but to name a geographical imaginary construct from a situated gaze. In Thoreau's eyes, the North is more than a cardinal direction. It is an imagined, moral, and symbolic space, a place where the self encounters the land, the people who inhabit and or move through it, and other form of knowledge, a space through which it thinks transformation itself. What I have presented today opens more questions than it gives definitive answer. Many other angles could have been explored. It is unfortunate that Thoreau was never able to complete the work. It seemed to be taking shape from his Canada and Indian notebook. And I hope that my research in the Walter Harding collection will allow me to deepen this inquiry into Thoreau's relationship to Canada and his Northern imaginary, but the trace he left still allows us to continue reflecting on the representation of the North as a site of learning. Thank you very much for your attention.
I would like to say this is Sonia's first annual gathering, so thank you for coming and welcome her. All right? And is it the same for you? Second. Oh, well, then we can't credit him for coming first, okay? Here's the phone. It's right here.
No, I was looking for my little cup of water.
And you get the same treatment, 13 minutes.
Oh, I know.
Yeah, you've been watching me.
Yeah. There we go. Don't start yet. I have some preliminary remarks. So this paper, which in your brochures says something about geography, came about because Michael and I were walking through one of the fields around here, Michael Frederick, and he was telling me that he thought that Thoreau, if he had not died so young, that he would have gone on to do a study that encompassed the people, the plants, the rocks, all of these things. And I said to him, that sounds a lot like how they study geography in England. When I was studying there, there's a lot of geographers who were very remarkably philosophical. And they talked to me about their approach. And so I wanted to look into that and find out more about later Thoreau and what he might have done and how he might have approached it. And my research led me to Alexander von Humboldt, who is credited as being sort of the father of the modern discipline of geography. This paper is now actually called Thoreau's Fields. Now we'll begin. I start off with a quote from August 23rd, 1845 in the journal. "Why not live a hard and emphatic life, not to be avoided, full of adventures and work? Learn much in it, travel much, though it be only in these woods. I sometimes walk across a field with unexpected expansion and long-missed content, as if there were a field worthy of me. The usual daily boundaries of life are dispersed, and I see in what field I stand." In what field does Thoreau stand? That is the question I wish to address today. But before we can even attempt to answer that, we must first ask, what is a field? Certainly, as you saunter about Concord today, you will pass through many fields. Not far from this spot is the field where Henry David famously hoed beans. There's also Newberry Field and Madison Field, as well as Hanscom Field and the Emerson Playground and Field. This being America's semi-quincentennial, we must not neglect to mention the Revolutionary War battlefields. Sometime around 1849, Henry David had read Alexander von Humboldt's Views of Nature, Personal Narrative of Travels, and Cosmos. If the 100th birthday celebrations of Humboldt in the United States in 1869 are any indicator of his popularity, then this polymath was already a superstar. He was read and praised by Emerson since the 1820s. In 1846, the Swiss naturalist and scientist Louis Agassiz came to America and received an appointment at Harvard in 1847. For the young Thoreau, these two, Agassiz and Humboldt, were the two scientific luminaries whose contrary views of nature competed in the battlefield of ideas, not only personally for Thoreau, but in the arena of academics at the time. In 1847, Thoreau collected, quote, collected animals as scientific specimens for Louis Agassiz. He even found a few with which Agassiz was not familiar. But Agassiz's interest in these specimens was vastly different than Humboldt's approach. The former was interested in taxonomy. He made his name by naming other species and classifying them. Furthermore, on his view, nature and its work was static. Agassiz forcefully asserted his own spin of creationism, the notion that all species were created, quote, by a deity according to a fixed plan of creation, close quote. Humboldt challenged this view of nature. He said, quote, far from being static, this is a quote about Humboldt, Humboldt's ideal of harmony is dynamic and driven forward by instability. His universe surges with energies, and he points to evolutionary processes everywhere, from stars to fossils, the latter folded into geological strata like temporal mileposts. Indeed, Humboldt, who coined the word Jurassic, was one of the first scientists to sequence geological strata using organic fossils. What he lacked was merely the mechanism of evolution, and he died just months before his protege, Darwin, published the answer, natural selection, close quote. Like Emerson's deity described in his essay Art, the artist of Humboldt's cosmos is constantly, quote, improvising grim and glad at his block, close quote. Darwin provided the missing theory to Humboldt's insightful observations, and by 1860, the debate between Agassiz and Darwin was raging at the Boston Society of Natural History and in the scientific journals of the day. That same autumn, Thoreau's essay, quote, The Succession of Forest Trees, which observed the trees in and around Concord, was in accord with Darwin's theory and not Agassiz's. And in his journal from October 18th of that year, Thoreau remarked, quote, we find ourselves in a world that is already planted, but is also still being planted as at first. Darwin's theory implies a greater vital force in nature because it is more flexible and accommodating and equivalent to a sort of constant new creation, close quote. However, beyond the taking of sides in the creationism-evolution debate, Humboldt was more significant for Thoreau in terms of providing a role model who not only could allow the artist and scientist to be together, but pointed to the necessity of their coexistence. To approach the natural world in the manner of Agassiz was to kill it and see it from the perspective of death. But Humboldt offered a revolutionary approach to science, not atomistic but cohesive, not myopic but synoptic. Humboldt in Cosmos had said, quote, nature considered rationally, that is to say, submitted to the process of thought, is a unity in diversity of phenomena, a harmony, a blending together all created things, however dissimilar in form and attributes, one great whole animated by the breath of life, close quote. Humboldt's rational consideration of nature was radical in its scope, for it included not just what was found out there, but included that which the observer, or human beings, brought to it. Quote, all natural, cultural, and social phenomena are interrelated, he says. The continents, the oceans, the atmosphere, the vegetation, the stars, as well as worldviews and the arts must be studied as a whole. This is a whole that can never be abstracted from the singular, close quote. Such an approach to the natural world, it could be said, is the very opposite of, quote, transcendentalism. I'm using that very loosely here. Insofar as this perspective is an immanent one, there is no theoretical objective view from nowhere, as Thomas Nagel might put it. The observer does not transcend the observed, but is right there in the muck with it. And to the extent that the observer taints the object, it also thereby is a legitimate object of study as well. This is Schrodinger's cat before Schrodinger and his cat. Just at the time when the various academic disciplines were furtively exploring their own territory and preparing to defend that turf against all other disciplines, along comes this counterweight who says, quote, it is not possible to isolate knowledges from one another. All knowledge is, on the contrary, multi- and transdisciplinary. The isolation of disciplines is therefore a scientific equivocation. This totality of knowledge is organic, but it is the mind that captures the unity and diversity, the cosmos itself, close quote. It is clear that this new approach was welcomed by Thoreau, who saw in it something quite old. As he says in his response to an 1853 inquiry from Spencer Fullerton Baird, the first curator of the Smithsonian Institution, quote, the Secretary for the Association of the Advancement of Sciences requests me what branch of science I was especially interested in. Now, though I could state to a select few that department of human inquiry which engages me, I felt that it would be to make myself a laughingstock of the scientific community, inasmuch as they do not believe in a science which deals with the higher law. The fact is, I am a mystic, a transcendentalist, and a natural philosopher to boot. Now I think of it, I should have told them at once that I was a transcendentalist. That would have been the shortest way of telling them that they would not understand my explanations. If it had been the secretary of an association of which Plato or Aristotle was the president, I should not have hesitated to describe my studies at once and particularly. Believing in a science which deals with the higher law had more than theoretical implications. If, quote, nature, culture, and literature, or science, society, and discourse were for Humboldt not separate strands representing competing domains, but interwoven aspects of what he came to call the cosmos, close quote, then for Thoreau, these interdependent strands of the tapestry had ethical implications. Just as Agassiz's science attempted to excise the frog from the pond and pin it to the board in order to examine it until it became a dead thing, so too was the state's action vis-a-vis Anthony Burns the fugitive slave who had been captured here in Boston and put on trial to be sent back to the South. Just so too was the state's action vis-a-vis Anthony Burns, an act that turned a living human being into a thing, a commodity. To know is to kill, and just as Thoreau abandoned his earlier work of Agassiz, so too did he abandon his being enlisted in the work of the state in its murderous meting out of justice. The bridge between the field of scientific inquiry and the field of ethics is encapsulated succinctly by Kent Curtis when he says, quote, Thoreau's central concern was not the preservation of nature or the protection of the natural world from the actions of human beings, but instead was a deep and abiding concern for the preservation of freedom in its most grounded and concrete manifestations, whether that be in the expression of moral conscience against imperialism, slavery, and the commercial economy, or in the expression of rejuvenation found in the wild tendencies of living nature, close quote. Humboldt saw that in this great chain of causes and effects, no single fact can be considered in isolation, close quote. But such a worldview is not the same thing as the taxonomy of Agassiz, even if Agassiz and his ilk inhabit a great and expansive worldview. As Humboldt said, quote, the geography of plants and animals must not be confounded with the encyclopedias of the natural sciences. In the work before us, partial facts will be considered only in relation to the whole. The higher the point of view, the greater is the necessity for a systematic mode of treating the subject in language at once animated and picturesque, close quote. The use of language in this way, that is, poetically, allowed for the synthesis of Thoreau's predominant personalities, scientist and artist. This new way of inquiry and analysis, begun with Humboldt and transformed by Thoreau, is what we would today call ecology. And this is a long quote. It is not simply a question of a unity of nature that ignores difference, but of a unity in diversity that depends on the rich diversity of nature. Each herb, each insect plays a crucial role within any given ecosystem. Every ecosystem depends on biodiversity. The expressions Humboldt uses, geographic region, designates what we would today call an ecosystem. Humboldt does not use the words biodiversity and ecosystem, but it is the same sense that these terms he emphasizes in the interconnection of nature. No plant, no animal is an isolated specimen. Each one is part of the web of life, close quote. This worldview is one of mutual implications. It is also isn't exactly new, for as we saw, Thoreau likened it to the worldviews of Plato or Aristotle. It is also quite consonant with Eastern philosophy. For instance, Alan Watts, in talking about nature, likes to talk about a bee-flower, as an example of an Eastern approach to phenomena. That is, without bees, there are no flowers. No flowers, no bees. Quote, they go together, and in that sense, they make up a single system. Substitute the word system for the word organism, a single life form, a single individual. Bees and flowers, however different they look, they go together. He goes on to say that just as you can't isolate the bee from the flower or the flower from the bee, so too you cannot isolate the bee and the flower from the field. So it is really the whole field that is flowering, because the flower couldn't exist in that particular place without the special surroundings of the field that it has, close quote. Similarly, we could substitute for both system and organism, as well as geographic region, there's my timer, and ecosystem, the word field. In this sense, Thoreau is the field. He stands in a field that is a pasture, and that pasture is part of the field that Humboldt called cosmos. All of these fields are interconnected and interdependent, and are the academic fields, that find it so difficult to pin down Thoreau. Literature, philosophy, botany, cartography, geography, meteorology, ecology, we could go on. However, with a field like Thoreau's, he is correct when he says, quote, the usual daily boundaries of life are dispersed. That is to say, Thoreau's writings challenge the reader who approaches his writings with the usual conceptions of a field of study or academic disciplines, even of who Thoreau is and what he stands for. This was even a challenge for Thoreau. On August 19th, 1851, he reflected, quote, "I fear that the character of my knowledge is from year to year becoming more distinct and scientific. That is, exchanged for views as wide as heaven's cope, I am being narrowed down to the field of the microscope. I see details, not wholes, nor the shadow of the whole. I count some parts and say, I know." Yet even as he wrote those words, he had cautioned in the same journal entry, quote, "How vain is it to sit down and write when you have not stood up to live. Methinks that the moment my legs begin to move, my thoughts begin to flow, as if I had been given to that stream at the lower end, and consequently new fountains flowed into it at the upper. 1,000 rills which have their rise in the sources of thought burst forth and fertilize my brain." I see I've run out of time, but there's one more page. I won't read it for you now, but if you're interested, I'm happy to send you the paper. Thank you.
Who's going to be first? There we go, in the back. Can you shout it out, or do you want the mic? Oh, Kurt's got a mic.
This was a really fun panel. Thank you all. I have a question for Sonia in particular, and I love your topic. I find this really compelling, thinking about images of the North and Thoreau, and I'd love to talk more sometime about his botany, when he sort of like literally encounters these like northern fragments of botanical landscapes. But I want to ask about Yankee in Canada in particular, because I love that essay, and frankly, I hate that line, "all I got in Canada was cold." It's like a joke that's been repeated about it forever, and it's Thoreau's joke, so it's appropriate, But I think it kind of dismisses a couple really interesting things that he's trying to do there and kind of struggling with, and maybe not successfully, but, that's like his only excursion that's kind of a tourist trip. Like, he's mostly on the trains and on the steamers and going really fast and in crowds of people, and like that doesn't work for him. He's also quite surprised by things, and I think you're right that there's that tension between New World, what feels to him like a very old culture. He thinks about it as like a medieval culture. But I want to know what you think about the scene with the waterfall, when he finally does slow down and get out on that walk, Saint-Anne, and he's like spellbound and doesn't know how tall the waterfall is, like 100 feet, 200 feet, 300 feet. Like Thoreau can't imagine like a range of 300 feet or 200 feet for Thoreau. He doesn't do that, like everything's very precise. But he also has this section afterwards where he's thinking about the language and kind of dreaming of the landscape beyond, and I could follow this river. It's actually quite short, but I could follow this river way up into the interior. And is that kind of part of the payoff, you think, of Yankee in Canada, or is there another moment there that's particularly interesting, or is it primarily, as you said, and I agree with this, like the research? Like, what should we as readers take away from Yankee in Canada, I guess, is the short version of the question.
Sonia, let's use the microphone for the recording. Thor, good?
Sorry? Yeah. It's all right? Okay. It's a really complicated question, because I didn't have time to speak about Thoreau's view on the landscape, and are beautiful, I think, the description he took from Canada and everything. Of course, today my main goal was more to try to understand why he looked at the Canada with the books he read, and with a romanticized maybe a perception of the Canadian who are not like that anymore. I remember when I saw the documentary about Thoreau, someone was talking about he's looking for relics. I think with French Canadian is also looking a little bit like with a relic view. I don't know if it's the right term to use here, but just to, like one example, it's like if you was looking for a really mobile man, the woods man, and after the British conquest, all the mixed families and marriage between the French Canadian and the indigenous people were not tolerated anymore. So colonial law, racial classification and settlement policies create division between community and even in families. With the law, some family have to hide the ancestry of the indigenous people. So just by Thoreau's period, this was no longer the same and interconnect world. And when he say it's a sensitive question, especially today, but given the current political context, but when he speak about like annexation or revolution, I will not treat Thoreau's remark as a direct political program, of course, no. But first, for Thoreau, I think improvement were central, and he didn't find in the French Canadian of during his visit, like the independence and improvements. He did not, to him, French Canadian did not improve in the moral and transformative occupied land. I did not a sense of that mattered to him. And I can see the Canadian context itself, because a lot of article I read talk about the humoristic way of Thoreau in this Yankee in Canada, but I see something else. After the British conquest and after the rebellion of 1837 and 1838, some French Canadians were drawn to Republican ideal and to emancipation from British rules, and many took refuge in the United States. And around 1849, if I'm right, there was even an annexationist, thank you, movement in Montreal. So I'm wondering if Thoreau knew that. So I think there are really much more layers that we can see in a Yankee in Canada that I wish to try to look at. And I don't know if if I answered your question well, but it's like if I think there's much more to see.
Thank you. That's a long question and a long answer, but I learned a lot about Yankee of Canada, so that's good. Let's have another one. Court, we have Jim saying, oh, there he is.
Yeah, this is mostly, I think, for Jason, but maybe for any of the panelists. I think of Thoreau as a botanist, limnologist, geologist, climatologist, ecologist, cartographer, geographer, sociologist. I wonder what you would label him, because in the end, I think I would call him an evolutionary theologist.
You could stand up.
I would say that I would resist giving any label to him. Actually, through my conversations with Michael Frederick, Michael has suggested that he wouldn't join any organization, even though he would host the women's abolitionist movement. He wouldn't join them because he saw becoming a member of a group, I don't know if I'm paraphrasing Michael correctly, but becoming a member of a group diluted his agency rather than multiplying it. And so I don't think that he would be very eager to place any label on himself. The last page, I sort of was leading into it, was a suggestion that Thoreau is nothing but a field, right? And I use that term in the way that modern physics uses that term, that he's he's this energy band through which all these things are moving and coming out. And so, much like in your answer to the first question, what are we to take away from a Yankee in Canada? It's like going out, to the ocean and saying, what are we supposed to pull away from here? You could see a whale, you could see mollusks. The layers are so multifarious that there's no one way that you can say what you're going to take away from it. And I think that, as the expression goes, when the student is ready, the teacher will appear. Whatever you bring to the text, you're going to find it there. So.
Thank you. It makes me wonder, what do you think about the label Yankee?
Well, I was thinking about labels here too. In the 19th century, it was so commonly expected in Boston that Boston was the hub of the universe. And when we start thinking about directional messages, the primitive North captures so many detail levels. The Wild West goes even further towards creating a whole cultural expectation. The Deep South, which automatically thinks about Cotton Kingdom and the slavery, or the exotic Far East, where we picture all of these preset pictures where it's just captured with a phrase, sheer directional phrase, lifts up a whole notion of philosophy.
Totally agree. So what is New England's sense of place? Yeah, right.
That was one other thing that I didn't get to say, was that unlike Humboldt, who went to South America and discovered something like 2,000 new species, and unlike Darwin, who went to Patagonia, Thoreau had very few travels, most of which he was asked to do, and he discovered under his own feet, a whole world. So I think that's one of the things that we can take from him, is that, right here, wherever you are, you can find an interesting observation.
This is a question for
Okay,
Jason.
Victor's got a question.
And it's going to be a question about Thoreau and Emerson. So Humboldt would certainly have encouraged a mingling of the life sciences with arts and literature and maybe even politics. So there, in the hub of the universe, there was the Saturday Club. And in 1858, Agassiz went camping in the Adirondacks with Ebenezer Rockwood Hoare, Judge Ebenezer Rockwood Hoare, the painter, Stillman, with the founder of the Atlantic Monthly. Help me out here. A fable for critics. All right, great literary figures, and Emerson is on that trip. Now, what ties these guys together, apart from the Saturday Club, is mostly Harvard connections. This is 1858, so this is before Origin of Species, but it's after Emerson has joined the anti-slavery movement. It's after Agassiz is known for his support of slavery. And I'm just wondering if that would have created some friction between Thoreau and Emerson, that Emerson is still hobnobbing with Agassiz that late.
That's a good question. I don't know enough about that relationship. It is surprising, especially since in Humboldt's Cosmos, utilizing this multivalent perspective, he goes from studying nature to making pronouncements about how slavery is immoral, because we don't find that in the natural world, that is a superimposition by human beings. And so Humboldt has a very anti-slavery stance in his writings. And I think that it's clear that Thoreau has moved away from Agassiz, but it's not exactly clear to me that they were ever not on speaking terms due to the politics. If anybody else has a better answer, I'm open to that.
We have another question. Court, you have a mic? And we don't want to forget Dale. He's back there in the back part. Okay, good.
I'm going to loop Dale in. Thank you all for 3 very thought-provoking papers. And I see a lot of shared points of contact, so it was a well-organized panel. And Jason, yours kind of, again, brought this home, which is why I think you're getting a lot of questions. And the question is directed at you, but it also ties in the first paper. Because I'm wondering about your field. I love the imagery. I love the science. I love the fact that it's a complex system, which I think science wasn't using the word complexity as emergence and in the evolutionary senses yet, but Thoreau's really moving towards that. And I see a parallel with what you were talking about with indigenous cultures. And I'm thinking about kinship theory and kinship as a kind of complex system. So you used the word freedom and you didn't get to really develop it. So I'm wondering, and this is just being really associative, but about any possible connections between the way you are using freedom and perhaps these indigenous notions of kinship.
We've traded mics. Thank you.
Thank you. One of the things that occurs to me is that, like, if we look at the pre-Civil War era and you look at the term naturalist, and you see people like Humboldt, you see a variety of different lesser-known names that are appearing in England, they're appearing in the United States, they're appearing across Europe. And it seems that one of the things that they do is they don't separate out folk tales and narratives from geologic strata and soil types, and you get this huge, conglomeration of different and lifeways, yes, that are in some ways they delve actually pretty deeply into the culture of a place, and I wonder, does that extend then to, say, where the encounter is with indigenous peoples? That because the naturalist at that time is doing that sort of all-encompassing, well, the almost laundry list of pre-professional disciplines that only arise by the end of the century, but they're all there, all of the approaches. And so looking at a Alaska native's cosmology about the stars, and then finding also discussion of the geology of the tundra and all these different things together, I think they are trying to sort of inch towards a comprehensive view of ecology. And Ernst Haeckel is eventually going to come up with that term. But as was pointed out by Jason, that idea was already there with someone like Humboldt. And so for indigenous people, though, there's an added layer, and I don't want to monopolize this, but there's an added layer of discussion of, okay, well, you're trying to understand them, but you also think they're another. And I wonder if, in many cases, the naturalist is coming up against a wall where they think they can't go any further in trying to understand them. They're trying, or maybe sometimes they may often say, I do understand them, and they don't.
Okay, thank you, Dale. What I'm going to do as moderator is say we have time for one quick question. Otherwise, I'm going to thank everybody for this very informed discussion. You have a final discussion? Do you have a final comment that you wanted to make in response?
Really quick, as I tried to suggest, it's interesting because Humboldt is sort of like on this precipice where academia could have gone either way, and he was pushing for an academia where there was not a clear and rigid division between academic disciplines and fields. And we clearly, I mean, I'm not sure about every school, but at least here in America, we clearly rejected that and have. But it is heartening to see and to hear here at this meeting the very diverse backgrounds that people come from. And I think that Humboldt and Thoreau would be encouraged to see the cross-cultural pollination that takes place.
That, to my mind, is a wonderful way to end this, with the word cross-pollination. So let's just keep that going, and thank you all for coming, and I look forward to seeing you for the rest.